Welcome to Sleepy Crimes. I am Anna, your host. Tonight, we drift into the shadows of the story of Svante Grände, a man known to history as the Swedish Shepherd. Our journey begins far from the heat of South America, in the quiet, silver-hued landscapes of Sweden during the late 1940s. Imagine, if you will, the small village of Tivaker. The air there is often crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and the sharp, clean aroma of pine needles. In 1947, specifically on the 26th of March, a boy was born into a house filled with the soft murmurs of prayer and the rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock. He was the fifth of 7 children born to Gustaf Grände, a local vicar, and his wife Anna Karen. In a home led by a man of the cloth, the world was viewed through a lens of duty, compassion, and a quiet, steady faith. Young Svante grew up surrounded by the sounds of the Lutheran church, the heavy creak of wooden pews, the faint, metallic scent of the communion silver, and the way the light filtered through stained glass, casting long, violet shadows across the stone floor. He was a child of the North, shaped by the long, dark winters where the only warmth came from the hearth and the shared stories of a large family. But even then, beneath his calm exterior, there was a growing curiosity about the world beyond the Swedish horizon, a world that did not always mirror the peace of his father's parish. As the years stretched into the 1960s, Svante's world expanded. He was a brilliant student, drawn to languages and the complexities of history. He spent time in France, at the University of Aix-en-Provence, where the air was thick with the scent of lavender and the heated political debates of the era. He traveled through North Africa and Czechoslovakia, his eyes opening to the vast inequalities of the mid-20th century. By the time he returned to Sweden to finish his degree in Uppsala, the quiet life of a vicar no longer seemed enough. He felt a pull toward the south, toward the vibrant, turbulent lands of Latin America. In 1971, at the age of 24, Svante boarded a plane for Chile. When he arrived, the air was a revelation, heavy with the fragrance of blooming jasmine and the salt spray of the Pacific Ocean. He was there as a volunteer, a member of an aid organization dedicated to helping the marginalized. He was sent to the south, to the province of Valdivia, a place where the mountains rose like jagged emeralds against a sky so blue it felt infinite. He settled in the Panguipulli timber complex, a vast network of forests and sawmills. Here, the air was filled with the constant, low hum of machinery and the overwhelming, sweet smell of freshly cut cedar and Raleigh wood. In Panguipulli, Svante found his mission. He was not there to preach from a pulpit, but to teach. He sat with the forestry workers, men with hands as rough as the bark of the trees they felled. In the dim light of modest wooden cabins, under the soft glow of kerosene lamps that flickered and cast dancing shadows against the walls, he taught them to read and write. He would watch as their calloused fingers carefully guided pencils across cheap, yellowed paper, tracing the shapes of letters for the very first time. There was a profound silence in those moments, broken only by the crackle of a wood stove and the distant, lonely howl of the wind through the Andean peaks. Svante was a striking figure among them, tall, with fair hair that caught the light, earning him the nickname El Suco, the Swede, or the blonde priest. He lived simply, his rooms sparsely furnished with a small bed and stacks of books that smelled of ink and old glue. He ate the same simple meals of beans and bread as the workers, his life becoming inextricably woven into the fabric of the forest. The idealism of the time was palpable. The air felt charged with the hope of a new society, a belief that justice could be carved out of the rugged wilderness through education and collective labor. However, as the calendar turned to 1973, the atmosphere in Chile began to shift. The hope that had once felt as solid as the mountains started to feel brittle, like dry leaves underfoot. In the capital of Santiago, political tensions were boiling over, and even in the remote forests of the south, the change was felt. The radio, once a source of music and community news, began to crackle with increasingly frantic reports. The stillness of the forest started to feel heavy, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. Svante noticed the change in the eyes of the men he taught, a flicker of anxiety, a lowering of voices when strangers passed by. The smell of wood smoke in the air now seemed to carry a hint of something more acrid, a precursor to the fire that was about to consume the nation. He was no longer just a teacher. He was a witness to the fractures of a country being pulled apart. He continued his work, his voice remaining calm and steady, but his heart was beginning to align with the struggle of those he served. He saw the poverty and the desperation of the workers, and the peaceful teachings of his father's church began to merge with a more radical call for social change. Everything changed on the morning of September 11th, 1973. It was a day that began with a deceptive quiet. In the mountains of Valdivia, the mist clung to the valleys, a thick white blanket that muffled all sound. But soon, the roar of Hawker Hunter jets cut through the sky, their metallic scream echoing off the mountain faces like a premonition of death. In Santiago, the presidential palace, La Monda, was under siege, smoke billowing into the heavens as a military junta led by Augusto Pinochet seized power. The news reached the timber complex in fragments, static-filled radio broadcasts and whispered warnings. The world Svante had known, a world of literacy classes and community building, vanished in an instant. The military began to move into the countryside, their boots echoing with a sharp, rhythmic thud against the forest floor. The scent of gunpowder and diesel fuel began to replace the aroma of the pines. Svante knew that as a foreign activist and a friend to the workers' movements, he was now a target. He watched as friends were led away, their faces pale and etched with terror. The peaceful shepherd of the forest was forced to make a choice that would alter the course of his life forever. As the sun dipped below the horizon on that fateful September day, casting a deep, blood-red glow over the Andean peaks, Svante Grände did not flee back to the safety of the Swedish embassy. Instead, he stepped out of his small cabin for the last time. He felt the cold mountain air on his face, a stark contrast to the heat of the fires burning in the cities. He carried nothing but his convictions and the memory of the men he had taught to read. He disappeared into the dense, dark foliage of the forest, moving like a ghost through the ferns and the shadows. He joined the ranks of the Movimiento de Izquierda Revolucionaria, the MIR, trading his books for a different kind of resistance. He was 26 years old, the son of a vicar, now a fugitive in a land that had become a battlefield. The transition was absolute. The man who had once sought to bring light through the written word was now forced into the darkness of the underground. As we leave Svante tonight, he is a shadow among the trees, a Swedish shepherd following a path that leads away from the pulpit and deep into the heart of a revolution. Close your eyes now and imagine the silence of that forest, a silence that hides 1,000 secrets yet to be told. Breathe deeply, let the details fade, and drift into a peaceful sleep. The transition from the quiet, orderly streets of Uppsala to the rugged, untamed slopes of the Chilean Andes was not merely a journey of thousands of miles, but a profound transformation of the soul. Svante Grände, the fifth of 7 children born to a vicar in the peaceful Swedish town of Tvååker, had arrived in South America with a heart full of humanitarian zeal. In 1971, he was a teacher, a man who believed in the power of the written word to liberate the mind. He spent his days in the Panguipulli timber complex, surrounded by the towering, ancient trees and the smell of fresh-cut cedar, teaching illiterate woodworkers how to form their names with charcoal and graphite. But as the political atmosphere in Chile began to simmer and boil, the scent of sawdust was replaced by the ozone of an approaching storm. The literacy books that once sat so heavily in his hands began to feel light, almost insubstantial, compared to the gravity of the social inequality he witnessed every day in the deep valleys. He saw the calloused hands of the workers, the hollow eyes of children in the logging camps, and something within his calm, Scandinavian exterior began to fracture and reform into something far more tempered and sharp. When the morning of September 11th, 1973, broke over the horizon, it brought with it a cold, biting wind that seemed to carry the very taste of iron. The news of the military coup rippled through the mountains like a physical blow. For Svante, who had undergone rigorous military service in the Swedish army and mastered the complexities of the Russian language, the choice was not a matter of if he would resist, but how. He did not seek safety in the embassies or the bustling streets of Santiago. Instead, he turned his back on the life of a peaceful aid worker and looked toward the emerald shadows of the Neltum forest. His radicalization was a slow fire that had finally reached the brushwood. He joined the Movimiento de Izquierda Revolucionaria, known to many as the MIR, and shed his identity as the son of a vicar. In the eyes of the movement, he became El Comandante Julio, or simply El Suco, the Swede. He felt the weight of a rifle against his shoulder, a cold and heavy contrast to the warmth of the classroom, and he stepped into the dense undergrowth where the sunlight struggled to penetrate the canopy. The retreat into the mountains was a grueling test of endurance and silence. Every step taken on the damp, moss-covered floor of the Valdivian rainforest was a deliberate act of defiance against the regime that now claimed the cities. The air in Neltum was thick with moisture, tasting of wet earth, rotting leaves, and the sharp, medicinal tang of the arayan trees. Svante led his small group of comrades higher, toward the jagged peaks that stood like silent sentinels against the gray sky. They moved through the shadows of the Koihu and Araucaria trees, giants that had stood for centuries, their bark rough and scarred by time. The silence of the Andes was absolute, broken only by the occasional cry of a mountain bird or the distant, rhythmic roar of a hidden waterfall. Each night they huddled in makeshift camps, the cold seeping through their thin layers of clothing, their breaths rising in silver plumes that vanished into the darkness. Svante's military training became his greatest asset. He taught them how to move without leaving a trail, how to read the language of the wind, and how to survive on nothing but the strength of their shared conviction. As they ascended further into the tactical isolation of the high Andes, the world they had known began to feel like a distant, fading dream. The lumber mills and the dusty roads of the valley were swallowed by a sea of green and gray. Svante watched the mountain passes with the eyes of a man who knew that the hunters were already gathering in the lowlands. The revolutionary dream was no longer found in pamphlets or late-night debates in smoky rooms. It was found in the grit beneath his fingernails and the ache in his joints as they climbed. He thought of his family in Sweden, of the quiet rectory and the soft light of the northern sun, but those memories were now buffered by the immense, crushing beauty of the Chilean wilderness. The shadows here were long and deep, stretching across the granite faces of the mountains like fingers of ink. They were becoming ghosts of the peaks, specters of a movement that refused to be extinguished. In the stillness of the Neltum Heights, they prepared for a struggle that they knew would be long, bitter, and perhaps final. The mountain air was thin and sharp, biting into their lungs, a constant reminder that they were now existing in a space where only the strongest spirits could endure the coming winter. In the emerald shadows of the Panguipulli timberlands, the air did not merely touch the skin. It bit into it with the sharp, persistent teeth of a southern winter. Svante Grände, the man they now called Julio, moved through this vertical world with a quiet, deliberate grace that belied his origins in the flat, pastoral reaches of Sweden. Here, beneath the towering canopies of ancient Rabel and Koihu trees, the silence was a living thing, broken only by the rhythmic drip of condensation from moss-covered branches and the distant, haunting cry of a bird deep within the thicket. Every step he took was a negotiation with the earth itself, a careful placement of boots upon slick, rotting logs, and the treacherous, charcoal-colored soil that threatened to give way under the weight of his gear. He was a man of the North, born as the son of a vicar in 1947. Yet here he stood, a ghost in the Chilean Cordillera, his blonde hair hidden beneath a rough cap, his blue eyes scanning the horizon for the telltale glint of a military patrol. The transition from a peaceful aid worker to a commander of the resistance had not been a sudden snap, but a slow, tectonic shift in his soul, driven by a vow that now bound him to these mountains more tightly than any border or bloodline ever could. The scent of the forest was thick and intoxicating, a heavy mixture of decaying leaves, wet bark, and the sharp, medicinal tang of crushed ferns, and it clung to his clothes like a second skin, a constant reminder of the life he had chosen in the wild. The daily existence of the insurgents was defined by a brutal, repetitive rhythm of survival. Hunger was a constant companion, a hollow ache that lived in the pit of the stomach and made the mountain slopes feel steeper with every passing hour. They lived on the margins of the world, in the high places where the mist never truly lifted, and the sunlight reached the forest floor only in flickering, golden splinters. In the early mornings, before the first gray light had fully claimed the sky, Svante would wake to the sound of his own breath misting in the freezing air. His hands, once used to turning the pages of history books and guiding the pens of illiterate laborers, were now calloused and stained with the grease of his rifle. He would sit in the dimness, his fingers tracing the cold metal of his weapon with a reverence that was almost liturgical. The group would huddle together for warmth, their bodies pressed close in the small, cramped shelters they called tatucos, hidden pits dug into the earth and camouflaged with brush and soil. Inside these earthen wombs, the smell of damp wool and unwashed bodies was overwhelming, yet it was also the smell of a shared destiny. They would pass around a single, dented tin of mate, the bitter green tea providing a brief, caffeinated spark against the lethargy of the cold. And in those moments of shared warmth, the hierarchy of command faded into the deeper bond of brotherhood. Svante did not lead through the booming authority of a traditional officer. His power lay in his profound stillness and his ability to listen. Among the charcoal burners and timber workers who formed the heart of the resistance, he was known as El Suco, the Swede, a title that carried a weight of immense respect. He was a man who had left the safety of a prosperous, neutral nation to freeze in the Andes for a cause that was not his by birth, but by conviction. When the group sat around their meager fires, low-burning flames that they meticulously shielded to prevent the smoke from rising above the tree line, Svante would speak of a world beyond the mountains. He talked not of grand theories, but of the simple dignity of the worker and the inherent right to a life free from the shadow of the boot. His voice was soft, carried on the thin mountain air with a steady, calming cadence that could soothe the anxieties of men who knew they were being hunted. He became the political commissar of his unit, a role that required him to be both a soldier and a philosopher, a man who could steady a trembling hand during an ambush, and then, hours later, explain the historical necessity of their suffering under the flickering light of a tallow candle. As the months of 1974 turned into the harrowing uncertainty of 1975, the reputation of El Comandante José grew into something legendary. The military patrols of the junta spoke of him in whispers, a tall, fair-haired phantom who moved through the impassable terrain with the ease of a mountain lion. For Svante, however, the legend was secondary to the grueling reality of the retreat. The net was tightening around the resistance in the south of Chile, and the order came to move across the border into Argentina, toward the rugged province of Tucumán. This journey was a descent into a different kind of hell, a landscape of jagged peaks and thin, oxygen-starved air where the wind howled like a wounded animal. They moved mostly at night, guided by the cold, indifferent light of the Southern Cross, their path marked by the jagged silhouettes of the peaks against a violet sky. Every mile gained was a victory over exhaustion, and every dawn found them further from the homes they had left behind. Svante's commitment never wavered, even as his boots wore thin and his body grew lean and sinewy from the lack of nourishment. He had made a vow to the people he served, a vow that was etched into the very marrow of his bones. And as they crossed the invisible line between nations, he knew that the struggle was only beginning to deepen. The forests of Argentina's Tucumán province were different from the Chilean woods. They were denser, more tropical, filled with a humidity that turned the mountain slopes into a steaming, claustrophobic maze. Here, the group joined the People's Revolutionary Army, and Svante took his place within the Ramon Rosa Jimenez Mountain Company. The transition required a new kind of vigilance, as the Argentine military was launching its own brutal campaigns against the insurgents. Life became a series of long, grueling marches through the undergrowth, where every snapping twig sounded like a gunshot and every shadow held the threat of an ambush. Despite the escalating danger, Svante remained the anchor for his comrades. He would spend his rare moments of rest writing letters in his mind to the family in Sweden he would likely never see again, his thoughts drifting to the quiet vicarage in Tvååker and the soft, gray light of the Baltic Sea. Yet, when he looked at the faces of the men and women around him, their eyes tired but burning with a fierce, desperate hope, he knew he was exactly where he was meant to be. He was the foreigner who had become a son of the soil, a man whose life was now a testament to the idea that some things are worth more than safety, more than comfort, and even more than life itself. The shadows were lengthening now, and the air in Tucumán grew heavy with the scent of ozone and wet earth, signaling the approach of a storm that would soon change everything. The forests of Argentina's Tucumán province were different from the Chilean woods. They were denser, more tropical, filled with a humidity that turned the simple act of breathing into a heavy, laborious task. In the thick, emerald shadows of the mountains, the air tasted of wet earth and decaying ferns. Every step Svante took was muffled by a thick carpet of moss that felt like velvet beneath his boots, yet beneath that softness lay the constant threat of the unknown. The silence here was never truly silent. It was a vibrating, humming wall of sound, the screech of insects, the distant drip of moisture from the canopy, and the rustle of wind through leaves that looked like giant, jagged hands. Within this green labyrinth, Svante, now known by the code names Lieutenant Julio and Comandante Ricardo, sought a sanctuary that was rapidly disappearing. The canopy above was so thick it swallowed the sunlight, leaving the world below in a permanent, watery twilight. In this dimness, the lines between safety and danger blurred. The humidity clung to his skin like a second uniform, and the smell of wood smoke from the small, hidden cooking fires of the guerrilla camp mingled with the scent of wild citrus. It was a beautiful, suffocating world, and somewhere within its depths, eyes that did not belong to the forest were beginning to watch. But the danger was not just local. It was crossing borders, carried in the briefcase of men in dark suits and the coded transmissions of the DINA, the Chilean secret police. Under the cold, calculated leadership of Manuel Contreras, the DINA had begun to reach its long, skeletal fingers into Argentina. This was the dawn of Operation Condor, a shadow network where the borders between nations dissolved for the sake of repression. In the sterile, fluorescent-lit offices of Santiago, folders were being opened. One of those folders, thick with grainy surveillance photographs and intercepted letters, bore the name of the Swedish priest's son. To the agents of the DINA, Svante was an anomaly, a high-value target whose Swedish heritage made him a symbol they could not ignore. They viewed his presence in the revolutionary cells not just as a tactical threat, but as an ideological insult. They began to share his profile with their Argentine counterparts, creating a transnational portrait of a man they intended to erase. The cooperation was seamless and mechanical. Intelligence officers exchanged lists of names over coffee, their voices calm as they discussed the logistics of disappearance. The DINA brought a specific, honed cruelty to the hunt, a methodology perfected in the interrogation rooms of Villa Grimaldi. They did not just want to find him. They wanted to dismantle the very idea of him. The hunt intensified through the slow, agonizing process of infiltration. It began with the whispers. The secret police didn't always strike with a hammer. Often, they used a needle. They looked for the weak points in the resistance cells, the exhausted, the disillusioned, or those whose families had been taken into custody. These turned agents became the ghosts within the guerrilla ranks. Imagine the paranoia that began to seep into the camp, like the mountain fog. A man you had shared a bowl of maize with only 2 nights ago might now be marking your location on a topographic map. The DINA agents specialized in this psychological erosion. They would leave small signs of their presence: a cigarette brand not found in the local village, a set of boot prints that didn't match the sandals of the peasantry, or the sudden, unexplained absence of a courier. In the forest, Svante felt the weight of these invisible eyes. He noticed how the birds would suddenly go quiet in a specific ravine, or how the local farmers, who once offered a nod of recognition, now looked at the ground when he passed. The trust that was once the bedrock of the movement was being eaten away by a calculated, bureaucratic rot. Every shadow became a potential assassin, and every rustle in the undergrowth was no longer just an animal, but perhaps a man with a radio and a mission. Specific intelligence operations were launched to smoke out the Swedish priest from the dense cover of the Tucuman Monte. The military and the DINA began a strategy of blanketing, where they would isolate a section of the forest and slowly squeeze. They moved with a slow, grinding inevitability. They didn't just look for men, they looked for the infrastructure of survival. They searched for the hidden caches of medicine, the stacks of mimeographed manifestos, and the small, primitive hospitals hidden in caves. The intelligence officers scrutinized Svante's history, looking for patterns. They knew he was the son of Gustaf Grande, a vicar. They studied his past in the Panguipulli timber complex in Chile, piecing together his transition from a humanitarian worker to a soldier of the People's Revolutionary Army. They understood that his strength came from his conviction, and so they targeted that conviction. They spread rumors through the local villages that the foreign priest was bringing a curse of violence upon them. They turned the very people he sought to protect into the instruments of his location. The DINA used sophisticated radio direction-finding equipment, imported specifically for this hunt, to trace the faint, crackling signals of the guerrilla transmitters. The forest was no longer a shield. It was becoming a trap, and the metallic hum of the intelligence machine was growing louder than the heartbeat of the jungle. The atmosphere in the mountains grew colder as 1975 progressed. The rainy season brought a relentless, gray downpour that turned the mountain paths into treacherous slides of orange mud. Svante and his companions moved constantly, never sleeping in the same spot for more than 2 nights. Their clothes were perpetually damp, smelling of mildew and old sweat, but even the rain could not wash away the feeling of being hunted. The DINA's intelligence had become surgical. They knew his height, the way he carried his rifle, the specific lilt of his voice when he spoke Spanish with a lingering Swedish softness. They had captured a former comrade who, under the unbearable pressure of the electric prod, had described Svante's habits. His tendency to read by the light of a dying fire, his quiet moments of reflection that betrayed his religious upbringing. This information was typed onto crisp white paper and filed in a cabinet in Santiago, 300 miles away. Yet it felt as if the agents were standing right behind him in the dark. The circle was no longer just a metaphor. It was a physical reality of checkpoints, patrols, and informants. The whispers of the DINA were no longer whispers. They were the sound of boots marching on wet stone, the metallic click of a safety being disengaged, and the cold, unyielding certainty that for the man they called Ricardo, the forest was running out of places to hide. The mountain air in the province of Tucumán was thick with the scent of damp earth, and the heavy, sweet rot of fallen leaves as October 14, 1975, dawned. The forest here was a dense, emerald labyrinth, a world away from the rolling fields of Sweden where Svante Grände had been born 28 years earlier. Every step he took through the undergrowth was a study in silence and caution. His boots, worn thin by months of traversal through the rugged terrain, sank into the soft, yielding moss that carpeted the forest floor. He could feel the cold moisture seeping through the leather, a constant, numbing reminder of the elements. The group he led, part of the mountain guerrilla company known as Ramon Rosa Jimenez, moved like shadows between the massive trunks of the trees. Their breathing was rhythmic and shallow, a synchronized effort to remain unheard. Svante, known to his comrades as Comandante José, kept his eyes fixed on the shifting patterns of light that filtered through the high canopy. The sunlight was a pale, fractured thing, struggling to reach the floor through the interlocking branches of the massive cedars and laurels. Each snapping twig sounded like a gunshot in the oppressive stillness of the morning, and the taste of the humid air was metallic, carrying the faint, distant promise of a storm. By mid-morning, the physical exhaustion of the past year began to press down on him like a physical weight. The group had been on the run, moving from one temporary camp to another, always staying one step ahead of the encroaching military presence. His rucksack felt heavier than ever, the straps digging into his shoulders, chafing against the rough fabric of his jacket. He reached up to adjust the weight, his fingers feeling the coarse, grit-stained texture of the canvas. They had been living on meager rations, and the constant hunger was a dull, persistent ache in the pit of his stomach. To distract himself, he focused on the intricate details of the wilderness around him. He watched a beetle, its shell a shimmering, iridescent blue, struggle over a ridge of lichen-covered bark. He noticed the way the dew clung to the delicate fronds of the ferns, looking like tiny, translucent pearls in the dim light. This was the environment he had chosen, a landscape of extreme beauty and extreme danger, where the line between life and death was as thin as the mist that drifted between the trees. Every sense was heightened to the point of pain. The rustle of a bird in the brush, or the distant cry of a hawk, felt like direct communications from the forest itself, warning them of the invisible eyes watching from the shadows. The ambush was not a sudden explosion of sound, but rather a chilling realization of a trap closing. As they neared a small clearing near the farm of Yakachina, the silence of the forest changed. It became hollow, artificial. The birds that usually chirped in the upper branches had gone silent, and the wind had died down to nothing. Svante stopped, his hand resting on the smooth, cold metal of his weapon. He scanned the perimeter, seeing nothing but the dense wall of green. But then, there was a flash of something unnatural, the dull glint of sunlight off a steel barrel, a patch of olive-drab fabric that didn't match the varying shades of the foliage. Before he could signal his men, the first shot tore through the stillness. It was a sharp, dry crack that seemed to shatter the very air. The smell of acrid cordite and burnt powder instantly flooded his senses, masking the scent of the damp earth. He dove for cover behind the flared roots of a massive tree, the rough bark scraping against his palms. The forest was suddenly alive with the frantic rhythm of gunfire, the bullets thudding into the timber and shredding the leaves above their heads into a green confetti that drifted slowly to the ground through the smoke. In the chaos of the skirmish, time seemed to expand and contract. Svante moved with a desperate precision, his boots slipping on the slick mud as he sought a better vantage point. He could hear the shouts of the security forces, their voices harsh and metallic against the backdrop of the mountain. They were close, closer than he had imagined. The military had been patient, waiting for this exact moment to strike. He felt a sharp, stinging heat bloom in his side, a sensation that was at first confusing and then terrifyingly clear. He looked down to see a dark, widening stain on his clothes, the color of overripe cherries against the drab fabric. The strength began to drain from his legs, a strange, heavy lethargy taking hold. He slumped against the damp earth, his cheek pressing into the cool, wet moss he had admired only hours before. The sounds of the battle began to recede, becoming a muffled, distant echo, as if he were underwater. He could see the intricate patterns of a spider's web stretched between two stones, vibrating with the impact of the nearby footsteps. The world was narrowing down to these small, quiet things: the smell of the rain, the texture of the soil, and the fading warmth of his own breath in the October chill. As the finality of the moment settled over him, the violence of the ambush gave way to a profound and heavy quiet. The security forces closed in, their heavy footsteps crunching through the undergrowth, snapping the dry twigs and trampling the ferns. They found him lying there, the Swedish revolutionary who had exchanged the safety of Europe for the shadows of the Latin American mountains. His eyes were fixed on the canopy far above, where the tops of the trees swayed gently against a sky that was turning a pale, bruised violet as the afternoon waned. There was no grand speech, no final defiance. There was only the slow, rhythmic drip of water from the leaves onto the forest floor. The soldiers stood over him, their shadows long and jagged in the dying light, but Svante was already drifting away, his consciousness merging with the very wilderness he had tried to master. The blood that soaked into the Tucumán soil was a silent testament to a journey that had spanned continents and ideologies, ending here in a nameless ravine. The rain began to fall again, a soft, insistent drizzle that washed the smoke from the air and blurred the edges of the clearing, slowly erasing the traces of the struggle until only the silence of the forest remained. The silence that followed the ambush in the province of Tucumán was not a hollow thing. It was heavy, weighted by the humidity of the Argentine jungle and the sudden, sharp absence of a life that had traveled across worlds to reach this precise point of soil. In the immediate aftermath of that night in October of 1975, the jungle seemed to breathe in the smoke and the static, swallowing the identity of the man the guerrillas called Lieutenant Julio. As the soldiers moved through the undergrowth, their boots sinking into the soft, rain-dampened earth, the man who had once been a student of languages in Uppsala and a teacher of the illiterate in the Chilean mountains was reduced to a set of coordinates, a casualty in a shadow war that the world was only beginning to understand. The air was thick with the scent of crushed ferns and spent gunpowder, a sensory tapestry that would soon be replaced by the sterile smell of government offices and the cold, crisp air of the Swedish north as the news began its long, jagged journey home. Across the vast, churning expanse of the Atlantic Ocean, the news did not arrive like a thunderclap. It arrived as a whisper, a collection of uncertain syllables that traveled from the sweat-soaked heat of South America to the biting, frost-nipped air of a Swedish rectory in Tvååker. Imagine the home of Vicar Gustaf Grände and his wife, Anna Karin. It was a place of polished wood, the faint, comforting scent of old hymnals, and the rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock that measured out the peaceful hours of a Swedish autumn. They had raised 7 children in the light of the church, and Svante had been their 5th, a boy born in 1947 who seemed to carry the weight of the world's injustices in his quiet, thoughtful gaze. When the telegrams began to arrive, they were not clear. They spoke of disappearances, of a son who had vanished into the mountains, of a priest who had traded his vestments for a rifle. The paper of these letters was thin, almost translucent, and the typewritten words seemed to blur at the edges as if the ink itself was weeping for the distance it had to travel. The vicar would sit in his study, his hands, weathered by years of service, trembling slightly as he touched the cold, unyielding surface of the desk, waiting for a confirmation that his heart already feared. In Sweden, the reaction was a complex mixture of grief, confusion, and political tension. Svante Grände had become a symbol of a generation that refused to stay within the borders of their own comfort. He was a son of the church, who had embraced the theology of liberation with a literal, radical finality. To some in the Swedish government and the press, he was a tragic idealist. To others, he was a dangerous revolutionary who had stepped too far into the darkness of a foreign conflict. But to his family, he was simply Svante, the young man who had once studied Russian and history, the one who sent letters home filled with the smells of Chilean pine and the struggles of the poor. His father, Gustav, refused to let the silence of the Argentine military be the final word. He began a long, arduous search that would span years, navigating a labyrinth of diplomatic cables and closed doors. He reached out to international organizations, his voice a steady, mournful pulse in the ears of bureaucrats who preferred to look away. He received a letter from a leader of the resistance, a man named Edgardo Enriquez, who wrote of Svante's maturity and his bravery as a leader. This letter, written in the frantic prose of a movement under fire, became a relic for the family, a tangible piece of a son who was becoming a ghost. The mystery of Svante's final resting place became a quiet, enduring ache. In the years following 1975, as Argentina descended further into the period of the Dirty War, the term desaparecido, the disappeared, became a haunting reality for thousands. Svante was one of them, one of only 2 Swedish citizens to be swallowed by that darkness. His body was never officially recovered, never returned to the cool, quiet earth of the family plot in Sweden. There are stories, whispered by those who survived the camps and the mountaintop skirmishes, of mass graves in the red soil of Tucumán, or of bodies hidden where the jungle grows thickest. The physical absence of a grave meant that for his parents, the mourning never quite reached a conclusion. It was a grief without a border, a search that led them to the edges of the map and back again. The search for his remains was not just about the bones of a man. It was about the reclamation of a story that the military regime wanted to erase. They wanted to turn him into a phantom, a non-person, but the persistent memory of a vicar's son from Varberg kept his name alive in the cold halls of the Swedish parliament and the humid streets of Buenos Aires. Today, if you travel to the Park of Ecce Memoria in Jakobsberg, you will find a tree planted in his honor. It stands as a living memorial, its roots reaching deep into the Swedish soil, just as Svante's convictions reached into the earth of a continent half a world away. The wind rustles through its leaves with a soft, rhythmic shiver, a sound that bridges the gap between the snowy winters of his youth and the tropical heat of his final moments. His legacy is one of profound contradiction, a man of peace who chose the path of the sword, a priest who found his altar in the struggle for the oppressed. We look back at the life of Svante Grände and see the echoes of a world in transition, a time when the boundaries of faith and politics were blurred by the urgent cry of history. The details of that final ambush remain shrouded in the mist of the mountains, a story told in the negative space of what was lost. We are left with the image of a young man, only 28 years old, standing at the intersection of 2 worlds, choosing a path that led him into the heart of the mystery. The case rests now. Let the details fade. You are safe. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and have a good night. Sleep well.